There are moments in life when the quiet choices matter more than the loud victories. Moments when no one is watching, no applause follows, and yet something inside you is being shaped forever. We often believe strength comes from winning, from proving ourselves, from being seen. But real strength is often invisible. It shows up in small rooms, behind ordinary counters, inside decisions that cost us something. This is a story about self-worth, not the kind that demands recognition, but the kind that survives without it. A story about what happens when a person chooses truth over comfort, peace over approval, and integrity over fear. In a modest town where days moved slowly and names were easily forgotten, there lived a shopkeeper named Elias Morin. He believed he knew who he was. Life was about to test that belief. Elias Morin lived in a town that most maps ignored. It was the kind of place where mornings arrived without urgency, where shop doors opened at the same hour every day, and where people nodded to each other more out of habit than curiosity. Nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen there, and for a long time, Elias believed that was a blessing. His shop sat on the corner of a narrow street, squeezed between a closed tailor's store and a bakery that smelled like warm bread before sunrise. The sign above the door was faded, the paint chipped by years of sun and rain. Inside, the shelves were neat, almost obsessively so. Every item had its place, every price tag was straight. Order made Elias feel safe. He had inherited the shop from his father, along with the unspoken rule that a man's worth was measured by how well he kept what he was given. Elias followed that rule carefully. He opened the shop before the street stirred. He closed it after the last footsteps faded. He spoke politely, listened patiently, and avoided conflict whenever possible. To the town, Elias was reliable, quiet, forgettable in the best way. But inside him lived a constant, restless question. Am I enough? He didn't ask it out loud. He didn't even fully admit it to himself. Instead, it showed up in smaller ways, in how closely he watched customers' reactions, in how deeply he felt criticism, in how much relief he felt when someone praised his honesty or fairness. Those moments mattered more than he wanted to admit. Elias believed self-worth came from being seen as good, as trustworthy, as respectable. And while honesty was something he valued, approval was something he needed. The difference between the two was subtle and dangerous. At night, when the shop lights were off and the street was quiet, Elias would sit alone behind the counter. The silence pressed against him. He'd look at his hands, hands that had counted coins, weighed goods, and passed change back and forth for years, and wonder if this was all his life would ever be. He didn't want fame. He didn't dream of leaving the town. What he wanted was simpler, yet heavier. He wanted to matter, to be someone people trusted, not just because it was convenient, but because it meant something. To feel solid inside, not dependent on smiles or approval. But Elias didn't know how to build that kind of strength, so he leaned on routine, on discipline, on doing things the right way, hoping the feeling would follow. Every morning he told himself the same quiet promise: if I do everything correctly, I'll feel whole. And for a while that promise seemed to work. But life has a way of testing what we build our self-worth on, especially when it's built on what others think. Elias didn't know it yet, but the calm order of his days was about to be challenged, not by chaos, but by a choice, a small one, the kind that reveals who we truly believe we are, and whether we're brave enough to face it. Change didn't arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly, like sunlight moving across a floor. At first, Elias noticed it in the smallest ways. A bell ringing more often above the shop door, familiar faces returning twice in the same week, strangers lingering just a moment longer at the counter. The town hadn't grown, and the street hadn't changed. Yet something was different. People were choosing his shop. Elias told himself it was because of discipline, because he opened early and closed late, because his shelves were clean, his prices fair, his manner respectful. And he wasn't wrong. Every small success was earned. He worked with intention. He kept records carefully. He corrected mistakes immediately, almost painfully so. Each evening, as he locked the door, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle into his chest. This must be what purpose feels like. Word spread slowly, carried in conversations between neighbors and across kitchen tables. Elias became known as the shopkeeper who never cheated, who always measured twice, who would rather lose money than lose trust. Compliments reached him casually, but they stayed with him long after the words faded. "You can rely on Elias," people said. "He does things properly. He's honest." Those sentences became mirrors. Elias looked into them to see himself. The shop's profits increased just enough to notice, not enough to change his life, but enough to soften the edges of worry. He replaced a broken scale. He repainted the door. He fixed the flickering light above the counter. Each improvement felt like proof that his way of living was working. And with that proof came pride. Not loud pride, not arrogant pride, but a quiet, careful pride that wrapped itself around his identity. Elias began to believe that his worth was confirmed by the shop's success, by the trust he'd earned. Honesty wasn't just a value anymore, it was his reputation. And reputations can become fragile. He started paying closer attention to numbers, to margins, to what he might lose if things went wrong. The same discipline that once brought peace now carried tension beneath it. Every mistake felt heavier. Every slow day felt personal. Still, he pushed forward. He told himself that growth required sacrifice, that pressure was part of responsibility, that the unease he felt was simply the cost of becoming someone respectable. He worked harder, stayed later, smiled through exhaustion. Inside, something subtle shifted. Where he once acted from principle, he now acted from fear. Fear of losing what he had built, fear of disappointing those who trusted him, fear of becoming ordinary again. Elias didn't notice the change at first. He only noticed that his chest felt tighter at night, that rest came less easily, that the shop, once a place of meaning, now carried expectation. Success, he learned, doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it reveals what we're holding on to, and as the town's trust in Elias grew, so did the weight of maintaining it. He began to believe that being good wasn't enough. He had to appear good, always. The flaw was small, almost invisible, but it was there, waiting. The fall didn't arrive with noise or warning. It came disguised as a reasonable solution. One afternoon, near the end of a long week, a shipment arrived late. The supplier stood across the counter, tired and impatient, explaining shortages, rising costs, delays that Elias had heard too many times before. The numbers didn't add up the way they used to. Margins were thinner. Losses felt closer. Elias listened, nodding slowly, already calculating the damage. That evening, after the shop closed, he stood alone beneath the dim ceiling light. The ledger lay open before him. Rows of careful handwriting stared back like quiet witnesses. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled. Just one adjustment, he thought. A minor change in measurement, barely noticeable. No one would be harmed. Everyone did it, somewhere, somehow, and he would fix it later, when things stabilized, when the pressure eased. It wasn't greed that guided his hand. It was fear. Fear of slipping backward. Fear of disappointing the town. Fear of losing the identity he had built so carefully. Elias told himself the story he needed to hear, that this wasn't dishonesty, only survival. The pen moved. The choice was made. The next day passed without incident. Customers smiled. Transactions flowed. No one noticed. The world did not end. And in that quiet continuation, something dangerous settled into Elias's chest. Relief. Relief quickly learned how to justify itself. Once became twice. Twice became routine. The change was small enough to hide from others, but not from himself. At night, Elias avoided looking too closely at the numbers. He stopped lingering behind the counter in silence. He closed the shop faster, as if motion alone could outrun thought. Then the questions began. A regular customer paused, confused by a discrepancy. Another returned an item, uncertain. Elias explained smoothly, practiced calm, masking unease. Each conversation ended politely, but something shifted in their eyes. Trust doesn't break loudly. It thins. Rumors don't accuse directly. They circle. Elias felt it in the way greetings shortened, in the way conversations ended a moment earlier than before. He felt it in himself most of all, a constant tightening, a sense of being watched even when alone. One evening, he caught his reflection in the shop window as he locked up. The streetlight cast his face in harsh shadow. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man looking back. He had done everything right, and yet something was wrong. The fall wasn't the dishonest act itself. It was the moment Elias realized his self-worth had been tied so tightly to being seen as good that he was willing to lose goodness to protect the image. That night, sleep refused him. Because once you betray your own values, even quietly, the noise lives inside you, and there is no closing time for that. Elias didn't confront the truth. He reorganized it. Each morning he unlocked the shop with the same steady hands, straightened the same shelves, greeted the same faces. From the outside, nothing had changed. The rhythm of his life continued, familiar and controlled. And that was the story he clung to. That if life looked normal, then it was normal. He told himself the lie was temporary, that he would correct the numbers soon, that once the pressure eased, he would return everything to the way it was. But days passed, then weeks. The opportunity to undo the choice slipped further away, replaced by the fear of exposure. The cost of honesty grew heavier with time. Elias began to live in careful calculation of words, of expressions, of what might be noticed. Denial is rarely loud. It whispers. It soothes. He justified himself in quiet moments. I've done more good than harm. No one is suffering. This town needs the shop to survive. And yet every justification asked him to move a little further from himself. At night, Elias sat alone in the darkened shop, the smell of dust and paper thick in the air. He avoided the ledger now, avoided the silence. He found reasons to stay busy, repairing hinges that didn't need fixing, cleaning counters already spotless. Stillness had become dangerous, because in stillness the truth waited. He noticed how his chest tightened when someone mentioned honesty in passing. How compliments no longer warmed him, but burned instead. Praise had turned into a reminder of the distance between who he was and who he pretended to be. The town sensed it before he admitted it. Customers came less often. Conversations felt guarded. People still smiled, but their eyes searched for something, certainty perhaps, or reassurance that never fully arrived. Trust, once freely given, now required proof Elias couldn't offer without unraveling everything. And so he held on tighter. To the shop. To the routine. To the version of himself that once felt solid. Letting go felt impossible. Not because he didn't know the truth, but because accepting it meant admitting that his self-worth had been built on something fragile. That the respect he chased was conditional. That the strength he thought he had was borrowed. Denial became his shelter, a narrow one, but shelters shrink over time. And slowly, quietly, Elias began to suffocate inside it. Not from guilt alone, but from the exhausting work of pretending to be someone he no longer recognized. He told himself he could carry it, that this was the price of responsibility, that real adults lived with compromises. But deep down he knew something had been lost. Not the shop, not the money. Himself. The shop grew quieter. Not suddenly, but noticeably. The bell above the door rang less often. Footsteps passed the window without slowing. Shelves remained full longer than they should have. Elias told himself it was the season, the economy, the town's shift in habits. He told himself many things, but the silence felt personal. Days stretched longer now. Hours passed without conversation. Elias stood behind the counter, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator, the faint creak of the building settling. The shop, once alive with purpose, now felt hollow, like a stage after the audience has gone home. And inside him, something matched that emptiness. He stopped caring about small details. A crooked label stayed crooked. Dust gathered in corners he once cleaned daily. The discipline that once gave him strength now felt pointless. Without trust, real trust, routine became performance. Elias avoided mirrors. When he did catch his reflection, he looked older. Not in years, but in weight. His shoulders carried something heavy, something invisible. The man who once stood proudly behind the counter now leaned on it, as if the wood itself were holding him up. Nights were the hardest. He returned to a small apartment above the shop where the walls held no memories and the rooms echoed his thoughts back at him. He ate without appetite, slept without rest. The lie followed him everywhere, settling into his chest like a second heart. This was the moment he had feared, not being exposed, but being alone with himself. There were no voices accusing him, no dramatic confrontation, just the slow realization that the respect he craved meant nothing if he couldn't respect himself. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Elias sat on the floor of the shop after closing. He didn't turn on the lights. He let the darkness sit with him. For the first time, he allowed the truth to surface without resistance. He hadn't lost his way because he was weak. He had lost it because he was afraid. Afraid of being ordinary. Afraid of failing. Afraid of discovering that his worth was never guaranteed. The weight of that understanding pressed tears to his eyes. Not from shame alone, but from grief. Grief for the man he had been. Grief for the honesty that once came so naturally. Grief for the peace he had traded for approval. This was the lowest point. Not because everything was gone, but because nothing felt real anymore. And when nothing feels real, change becomes possible, but only if you're willing to face yourself in the dark. The encounter didn't feel important at first. It happened on a slow morning, one of many that had begun to blur together. Elias had opened the shop out of habit more than hope. The street outside was quiet, the air cool and pale with early light. He stood behind the counter, hands resting on the worn wood, staring without really seeing. Then the door opened. An older man stepped inside, moving carefully, as if each step carried memory with it. His coat was simple, his hair silver, his eyes calm in a way Elias hadn't seen in a long time. He nodded once, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement, as though they already shared something unspoken. The man wandered the aisles slowly, touching nothing, reading labels without interest. Elias waited, expecting him to leave empty-handed like so many others lately. Instead, the man approached the counter with a small item in his palm. "You've changed," he said gently. Elias stiffened. "I'm sorry?" The man smiled, not unkindly. "Not the shop," he clarified. "You." There was no accusation in his voice, no judgment, just observation. Elias didn't know why, but something in that calm certainty loosened his defenses. "I don't think we've met," he said. "We haven't," the man replied. "But I've known places like this, and people like you." He placed the item on the counter and looked Elias in the eye. "This used to feel lighter in here." The words landed softly and struck deeply. Elias felt the familiar urge to explain, to justify, to hide behind reason. But the man wasn't waiting for answers. He was waiting for honesty. "Why do you stay?" the man asked. The question was simple, disarming. Elias opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had many answers ready: responsibility, routine, necessity. None of them felt true enough. "I'm not sure," he admitted. The man nodded, as if this was the only answer that mattered. "Most people think strength is holding on," he said. "But sometimes it's knowing when something is costing you too much." He paid, thanked Elias, and turned toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused. "Peace," he said quietly, "doesn't come from being seen as honest. It comes from being honest, especially when no one is watching." Then he was gone. The bell rang once. The street swallowed him. Elias stood frozen, heart racing, the words echoing in the space the man had left behind. They weren't new ideas. He had known them once. But hearing them now felt like a mirror being held up, not to shame him, but to remind him. For the first time in a long while, Elias didn't push the feeling away. He let it sit. Truth had entered gently, and it had not asked him to run. Rebirth didn't arrive as a dramatic decision. It arrived as a quiet one. That night, Elias reopened the ledger. He did not rush. He did not look away. He sat at the counter long after the street fell silent. The pages spread before him like a history he could no longer deny. For the first time since the fall, he told himself the truth without defense. "I chose fear over self-respect." The realization hurt, but it also steadied him. Healing, Elias discovered, begins not with fixing everything, but with stopping the lie. He traced the numbers slowly, recalculating, correcting what he could. Some losses could not be undone. Some trust could not be instantly repaired. Accepting that was part of the discipline now. The next morning he made small changes. He adjusted measurements back to what they should be. He raised prices slightly, honestly, explaining when asked. Some customers frowned. A few left. Elias let them go. Letting go felt like standing in open air after years underground. He stopped rehearsing explanations, stopped overcompensating. He spoke plainly, even when it was uncomfortable. Especially then. Inside him, something began to realign. The anxiety didn't vanish overnight. Guilt still visited in quiet moments, but it no longer ruled him. Each honest action, no matter how small, felt like returning a piece of himself he had misplaced. Discipline took on a new meaning. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about consistency with his values. Elias began closing the shop earlier, choosing rest over exhaustion. He ate slowly, slept more deeply. When doubt surfaced, he didn't silence it. He listened. This was humility, and humility, he learned, was strength without armor. The shop remained quieter than before, but the quiet no longer accused him. It felt clean, honest, real. One afternoon, a regular customer returned, hesitant, cautious. Elias met her eyes without flinching. He explained a price increase simply. She nodded, accepting. The exchange was brief, ordinary, and yet Elias felt something shift. Not pride, peace. Rebirth is not the moment everything improves. It's the moment you stop betraying yourself. And in that choice, repeated daily, Elias felt something solid begin to grow. Not in the shop, but within. The hardest tests didn't come during the fall. They came after. As weeks passed, the shop found a fragile balance. Income was modest. Some days were slow. Others carried just enough to keep the doors open. Elias told himself this was enough, and most days he believed it. But old habits are patient. They wait for moments of weakness. One afternoon, a familiar pressure returned. A supplier offered a deal. Quieter this time, more subtle. Lower costs, flexible reporting. No one would know. The suggestion was wrapped in understanding, framed as help. Elias felt the old tightening in his chest. This was the real test. Not the obvious wrong, but the comfortable, almost right. For a moment his mind reached for the old logic. Just until things stabilize. Just this once. The temptation didn't feel evil. It felt reasonable. It felt kind. That's what made it dangerous. Elias closed his eyes briefly. He thought of the quiet peace he had begun to feel, of the way he slept now, of how it felt to meet his own reflection without flinching. He declined. The decision cost him. Immediately. The next month was hard. He cut expenses, let go of convenience. He felt fear return. But this time it didn't control him. Strength, he learned, isn't proven once. It's proven in repetition. There were days he questioned everything, days when he wondered if honesty was a luxury for those who could afford it. Days when being principled felt lonely, but each time he chose the same path. Not because it was easy, but because it was aligned. The new struggle wasn't about surviving the world, it was about staying true within it. And slowly, quietly, that consistency began to feel like something stronger than confidence. It felt like trust in himself. The dawn Elias woke to one morning felt different. Not brighter, not dramatic, just lighter. He noticed it in the way his breath settled before his feet touched the floor, in the absence of urgency, in the quiet acceptance of whatever the day might bring. For the first time in years, his mornings were no longer negotiations with anxiety. The shop opened as usual. The bell rang. Sunlight spilled across the floor. Dust floated lazily in the air. Ordinary things. Yet they carried a sense of meaning Elias had forgotten was possible. Customers returned slowly, not all of them, not in crowds, but the ones who came stayed. They asked questions. They trusted the answers. Conversations lengthened again, not because Elias tried harder, but because he was no longer hiding. Trust, rebuilt, moved at a human pace. Elias stopped measuring success by numbers alone. He measured it by how he felt at closing time, by the absence of tension in his chest, by the quiet pride that came from alignment, not applause. Purpose revealed itself in unexpected ways. The shop became a place of honesty, not because Elias advertised it, but because it lived there. Mistakes were acknowledged, prices were explained, promises were kept, even when it hurt, and something remarkable happened. Elias no longer needed to be seen as good. He simply was. The town noticed eventually, not in headlines or praise, but in trust returned without suspicion, in loyalty built slowly, authentically, in the quiet knowledge that some things once rebuilt properly are stronger than before. Peace settled into Elias's life like a steady companion. This was the new dawn. Not the reward for perfection, but the result of choosing self-worth over fear, again and again. There is a quiet truth hidden inside this story. It's not about a shop. It's not about money. It's not even about honesty as a rule. It's about self-worth, the kind that doesn't ask permission to exist. Elias Morin didn't lose himself because he was careless. He lost himself because he believed his value depended on being approved, admired, and protected from failure, and when that belief was threatened, he chose fear over truth. Maybe you've done the same. Maybe you've held on to something that slowly cost you your peace. Maybe you've justified choices that didn't align with who you really are. Maybe you've stayed quiet, stayed small, stayed comfortable, because letting go felt too risky. Here is what this journey leaves us with. Real strength is not the ability to maintain an image. It is the courage to face yourself when the image cracks. Self-worth does not come from being seen as honest. It comes from choosing honesty when no one is watching. Discipline is not about control. It is about consistency with your values, even when it costs you. Failure is not the end of your story. It is often the moment your real story begins. Letting go is not weakness. It is the release of what no longer respects you. Healing is not loud. It happens quietly, through small choices repeated daily. And rebirth does not require perfection. It only requires truth. If you are standing at a crossroads right now, between comfort and integrity, between fear and purpose, remember this: you don't need to prove your worth. You only need to protect it. Choose the path that lets you sleep peacefully at night. Choose the version of yourself you can live with in silence. Because in the end, the strongest life is not the one that looks successful. It is the one that feels honest. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. And if you want more stories like this, calm, reflective, and human, remember to like, subscribe, and stay. Your journey matters, and it's never too late to return to yourself.